Fan choice. And the winner for Game of the Year 2015 is The Witcher 3,
Uncharted 4,
Overwatch,
Sekiro,
The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild,
Amazingly, What Remains of Edith Finch?
And the Game Award for Game of the Year goes to God of War.
Game of the Year is an award that the gaming industry considers to be the highest honor it can bestow upon any given game. But when you really think about it, what does Game of the Year actually mean? How do you define it? When watching an award show, it's easy to think that whoever decides what gets Game of the Year is some super smart and informed person that objectively knows what makes a game good and what makes a game bad. Probably some old and seasoned game critic, or maybe someone who's an industry veteran who went to school for games and has made a ton of them themselves. But that doesn't matter. The fact is they know what's objectively good, so they must be right. Or at least they might lead you to believe that. In reality, nothing could be more subjective. Just because some guy who works in the gaming industry says that Ocarina of Time is the best game ever made, doesn't mean in the slightest that it's a fact of life. One thing that I think is important to realize is that video games count as art. It's easy to forget that when there are a lot of mechanics and optimization going into a game that deal with a lot of objective things. When you look at a game as a piece of art, it's easier to understand that saying something is objectively good just isn't very accurate. You'd never look at the Starry Night and the Mona Lisa and be able to prove which objectively is the better painting, and I'd say video games are in a very similar place. So if there isn't an end-all best game, what's the point of awards like this? I'd say it's an opportunity to discuss and display what a game might do great in your eyes. It's appreciating the hard work that got put in and marveling at the artistry. With all that said, how would you go about deciding on a Game of the Year for yourself? Or in this case, Game of the Decade? With so many fantastic games to have come out in the past 10 years, how could you possibly decide? Well, I think I've found mine, and it's...
They are rage, brutal, without mercy. But you will be worse. Rip and tear, until it is done.
To be completely honest, my qualifiers as far as Game of the Decade are pretty loose. I don't have specific rules that a game has to abide by to be considered. It doesn't even necessarily have to be my favorite game. It's just one of those things that I end up knowing. For this instance, Doom just kind of made more and more sense as I thought about it. There's so many complicated things that it does despite the game itself appearing pretty simple, which makes it really fun to not only play, but also to think about and discuss. Never in my life have I played a game that delivers its desired goal in such an effortless and satisfying way that seamlessly ties every aspect about itself into one cohesive and clear design goal. To fully grasp why I think this game is so incredible, I think the first thing we need to do is define what that design goal is. I know this is gonna sound a little silly, but I think it's true. Doom wants to make you feel like the Doomslayer, but not in the way you might be thinking. In a game like Spider-Man, the game effectively gives you all the power of the titular character without really needing to earn it. That isn't a bad thing, of course, but its method of delivering power is inherently different from Doom. Game Maker's Toolkit has a fantastic video on the difference between giving the power and earning it, which I will put in the cards at the top right. But the gist is games like Spider-Man or the Arkham series give you the feeling of being powerful without actually needing to have too much mechanical skill. The difference that Doom shows off is that you can make the player feel empowered and like the character you're playing without forcing them to play in a certain way while also making the player work for it. I'll get into what that means a little bit later, but first let's talk about what makes the Doomslayer himself. I know most people probably already know who the Doomslayer is, but in efforts to get everyone on the same page, let me explain. The Doomslayer is defined by one thing: the insatiable desire to kill demons. He doesn't have any clear backstory, he has almost no personality besides the aforementioned defining factor. He doesn't care why or how demons are where they are, he just wants them dead. He is pure and unadulterated rage against demons. He's an unstoppable force that feels only joy in maiming and killing the residents of hell. He's fast, agile, brutal, and efficient. He even mirrors a lot of what the player themselves are like. You buy this game to kill demons, he lives to kill demons. It's a match made in heaven. I would say the Doomslayer has 3 key design pillars, 2 of which makes him unique from other contemporary power fantasy characters like Master Chief or Kratos. The first of which would be, of course, power. The Doomslayer is superhuman strong, excellent with any firearm, and utterly ruthless, like rip your arm off and beat you with it ruthless. Considering his most iconic weapon is a chainsaw, it's no question that he's constantly showered with the innards of his enemies. The second pillar, however, I think, is what really makes him unique in the all too familiar gore-filled power fantasy genre, and that's agility. Of course, with someone like Kratos, agility in and of itself isn't the most unique thing, but the God of War isn't agile to stay alive. His agility is more in service of his power. It's almost acrobatic as to how he pulls off his combos, at least in the earlier God of War games. Doomslayer, on the other hand, isn't a god, he's just a human. He can't take legions of bullets to the face no problem. He can die rather quickly, so his agility is all about evasion and being impossible to pin down. When you play as him, you almost feel like a hunter, dodging and weaving and then striking when there's an opening, which leads me right into the last of the 3 pillars: efficiency. Sure, you're fast, ruthless, and insanely strong, but the Doomslayer doesn't revel in it. As soon as one demon is dead, he moves on to the next one. He's all about getting in, murdering, and getting out. He has every weapon necessary to take down any demon, and he thinks quick on his feet to efficiently take down whatever's in front of him so he can get to the next one. There's a reason the quote,
"The only thing they fear is you,"
is even a thing. And I think it's these 3 pillars, power, agility, and efficiency, working in tandem that make the Doomslayer who he is. Now that we know who the Doomslayer is, we can get into how Doom manages to take every piece of itself and point it right back to this one guy. The first piece that I feel does this the best is the gameplay. On the surface, you would think that making a game about the Doomslayer would be pretty simple. After all, it's just an FPS about killing demons. How could it be complicated? When you sit down to play Doom, it almost feels like you black out with how smooth and seamless the combat is. The game calls you to turn your brain off and just angrily rip and tear through demons, so the lasting impression is just, oh my god! Ooh! Oh god, oh god, oh god. Got him! Oh, here it comes! Bloop! Run, 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 run. Get the hell out! Damn. But when you disengage your bloodlust and look under the hood, there's actually a lot of smart design choices that make it so you can have those killing sprees. In other shooters, the general gameplay loop is you get behind cover, shoot some guys, move up to the next piece of cover, and repeat. You never really want to be out in the open, just simply because you'll die pretty quickly. But with Doom, the whole idea is to stay in the open and on the move. So how do you promote that to the player without being explicit? The first thing that Doom does is with its map design. Levels are large and wide open. There's next to no cover anywhere in any of the combat arenas, so there isn't really a place to stop. The maps also have routes, platforms, pathways, portals, and jump pads to help make you feel like you're dodging and weaving through the hordes. With so many enemies in a given area, you need to be able to move around them without them getting in the way. So the pathways laid out intersect in order to reroute yourself in case of a complication. Player choice is a huge part of the game, so having lots of options in where you go helps keep the feeling of being one step ahead. And outside of the necessity to keep moving because of the enemies around you, which act as a punishment for staying still, there's also ammo strewn all about to reward you for utilizing the whole map, because you sure as heck are going to run out of bullets. The next step Doom takes towards rewarding its target playstyle is the enemies. There are a lot of demons in one combat scenario, so the developers, id Software, needed to come up with a way to take those overwhelming odds and tip them in the player's favor. How do you make the player feel overwhelmingly powerful when you have 30 plus enemies shooting at you all at once with a minimal amount of health? There are a couple ways that Doom achieves this. First of which is how aggressively demons chase you down. Initially, it had all of the enemies push after the player pretty aggressively in hopes that would make the AI feel smarter. But they started to notice that this put the player in a position where they were always backing up, which ended up not being all that fun. And on top of that, it was a contradiction to their design goals. So they changed it to where the demons with guns would hold their position more, to leave the door open for the player to have more freedom in encounters. Demons who use melee as their primary source of damage output were left at about the same, but this got equaled out due to them having relatively less health than the other enemies. With all that wrapped together, it helped helped bring back the feeling of being the hunter and not the hunted. The next genius move that they made was the kind of damage that the enemies deal to you. As mentioned before, there are two kinds of demons, ones that use melee combat and those that use firearms. The melee enemies are made more doable with clearer weak points in the aforementioned lower health, but with the firearm demons, you'll notice one very important thing. None of them use hit scan weapons. It's all projectile based. What that means is when a gun is fired, the damage doesn't immediately hit the target like it would with a hit scan weapon. The bullets actually have to travel through 3D space to get to their target, which in this case, the bullets are relatively slow. This is a big deal because it gives you the opportunity to actually dodge most oncoming damage. And since the projectiles deal high amounts of damage, it's inherently rewarding the player to stay on the move instead of shooting statically from behind cover like in other FPSs. Speaking of playing differently from a normal FPS, Doom intentionally ditches some of the most common first-person shooter conventions, like ADS or aim down sights, for example. This mechanic is usually to promote being more accurate in other games, because when you aren't aiming down sights, accuracy is significantly reduced. The only trade-off being maneuverability. When in ADS, you move significantly slower, and the sensitivity of your look is lowered for higher accuracy. This feature is entirely absent from Doom, because if there were any kind of mechanic that slowed you down, that would immediately create a conflict with the agility design pillar. That's also why strafing and backing up are the exact same speed as running forward. With this feature being present, it creates the possibility of orbiting around enemies while in combat, which of course is promoted and rewarded by the fact that enemies use projectile weapons instead of hit scan ones. The last and most notable absent feature is the necessity to reload your gun, minus the super shotgun. If we're looking at this for realism, this is pretty dumb, but as a game mechanic, it makes a lot of sense. Think about it. What does reloading your gun call you to do? It requires you to stop shooting, find a place for cover because you can't defend yourself, spend 2 or 3 seconds waiting, then you get to go back to gameplay. When you want to focus more on realism, that ends up being just fine, but when your whole thesis is mainlining gunfire into your veins, reloading is just a redundancy. The only exception being the aforementioned super shotgun, which being a double-barreled shotgun, it wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense to not reload, but more importantly, reloading is a way to balance the fact that it outputs an insane amount of damage. So the main idea is to orbit and evade enemies, but in order to make you feel powerful, you also need to feel like you can get in there and get your hands dirty. Enter the glory kill. When you do enough damage to a demon to the point where they're almost dead, they then become stunned and begin to glow. This means that if you get close to them and press the melee button, a short but violent animation will play, killing your enemy, making you invulnerable for the duration of the animation, and also dropping some health pickups depending on how hurt you are. This way, it's not only satisfying to crush your enemies, but there's also a practical reason you'd want to. And it's not just the glory kills that promote feeling powerful, the arsenal of weapons that you have at your disposal also have a satisfying punch to them, while also promoting the orbiting and pushing in design that Doom so heavily tries to reward. Speaking of your weapons, they're the last piece of the gameplay pie that I'd like to talk about, at least in relation to combat. As the Doomslayer, you gain access to a very wide and diverse set of weaponry, ranging from an assault rifle, a shotgun, a Gauss cannon, a Gatling gun, and as mentioned before, a chainsaw, among many others. Each and every one of these tools of destruction feel weighty, impactful, and satisfying to use. What's magical though is that each of these have different practical uses in combat from each other. They don't all serve the same exact purpose. Because they all have different effective ranges and do different kinds of damage to enemies, you start to notice that certain weapons are better on certain enemies more than others. Not so much so that you'd be an idiot to use a different weapon, but just enough to nudge you in the right direction. Like for instance, if you were to fight a Pinky, you'd likely want to go with the shotgun or a super shotgun. Considering that a Pinky's tactic is to ram into you like a bull and their only weak spot is on their back, the natural strategy that you're going to pull is to let him come at you and then evade to get to his back. So since you're going to be close to him, the weapon that does the most damage at close range is the shotgun. Or on the other hand, the Mancubus has AoE damage if you get too close to him, and if you're far away, he shoots slow and inaccurate projectiles. That's Doom's subtle way of telling a player that being at range from the Mancubus is the safest route. And since he has so much health, you would want to go with a more powerful ranged weapon, which the Gauss cannon fits perfectly. Each enemy has the subtlety to them, that once you start to pick up on it, you'll see yourself not only being agile and deadly, but also quickly swapping between your 8 guns on the fly depending on the enemy you need to kill at that moment. Now, if you've been able to gather anything from my analysis of the gameplay, it's probably the fact that this game's combat is a full-on sprint. It takes 100% of your brain power, requiring you to not only have fast reaction time, but also make lots of quick decisions about where to go, who to kill, and how to kill them. And that's not even to mention the fact that being in a rage-induced blackout killing spree is exhausting on its own. So wisely, the entire game of Doom is not constant combat. Instead, the pacing of the gameplay is high-octane combat and then a rest period full of light platforming and puzzle solving. Now, the quality of these segments I'll get to later, but just the fact that id understands that it would be exhausting to play non-stop combat combat and then added these slower paced elements is genius. They don't last for very long, they're there just long enough for you to catch your breath, only for you to be thrust right back into the thick of it. Even in combat, the glory kill that I talked about earlier is a break in and of itself. Sure, it's only a second or so long, but it's a much needed break, if nothing else than to just blink and think about where to go next. Now I know, gameplay is ultimately what people play video games for, and obviously I think Doom's gameplay loop is incredible and deceptively complex. The game mechanics are so self-aware and effortless in how they get the player to behave in the way they want them to. But there's even more that this game does to point back to our old pal the Doomslayer, and that next piece would have to be the audio. And man, does this game excel in the audio department. The guns feel bassy and crunchy. The melee and glory kills feel powerful and have just enough squish to them. The demons sound just right. And overall, it just sounds crisp. I would argue that having satisfying sound effects is equally as important as having satisfying visuals. Sound gives that extra oomph that visuals just can't do on their own. It's especially important when your whole gameplay loop is based around putting you in a primal rage of gore and violence. That's not even mentioning the killer soundtrack. Which, by the way, did I mention that this game has a fantastic soundtrack? Because holy shit, this soundtrack is so good. This game is track after track after track bangers. For real, whoever decided to hire Mick Gordon to produce the music made the best decision of their entire career. Heavy metal is perfectly synonymous with the gameplay of Doom, the intensity of which makes you really want to tear some heads off. But don't just take my word for it, take a listen for yourself. Now, this soundtrack isn't just a banger because of the music, it's also because it directly services the gameplay. Doesn't it make you really want to kill some demons? There's a reason why when people remember this game, they remember the music. When you listen to it, you can immediately feel what it's like to play. With the gameplay and audio aside, the last piece that I think points back to the core design is something that a lot of people agree is not that great. And I partially agree, and partially think that's what makes it work. And that piece would be the story. I'll definitely get to why I think the story has problems along with all my other gripes with Doom, but first let me talk about why I think it works. Doom is the ultimate story doesn't matter kind of game. You buy Doom to kill demons, not figure out their backstory. And the story, for the most part, understands that. There isn't a cutscene every 12 seconds, there's no companions to get in your way, there's no dialogue trees, it's just you and the stellar gameplay loop. Pretty much anyway. Most of the story is delivered to you via completely missable audio tapes, holograms giving monologues that you can walk by, or by comm chatter. And even in the sparse story, it's eased with the knowledge that the Doomslayer just does not care about the plot either. They didn't lean into it as much as I probably would have liked, but seeing him destroy a monitor with a guy delivering exposition is the perfect example of what I'm talking about.
I think we can work together and resolve this problem in a way that benefits us both.
Wisely, Doom's story also doesn't attempt to have deep or complex characters. If it were to, that would inevitably distract from your one goal, and we can't have that. The bad guys are bad, and that's that. And I love that Doom is self-aware about that, which I feel extends to the whole game. Doom knows exactly what you want out of it, so it doesn't get in your way in the slightest. At least for the most part. Just like anything in this world, Doom isn't perfect, and despite how airtight and self-aware it is most of the time, it isn't without its blemishes. Now I know I just praised this game's story for being out of the way, but to be honest, it's not out of the way enough. There aren't a lot of cutscenes, but when there are, they can't be skipped. Sometimes just because they didn't implement a skip button for some reason, but most of the time it's because the game locks you in a room, leaving you only to run and jump around until the characters stop talking story at you. For a game that's supposedly very aware about about how people are going to play their game, Doom really missed the mark in this area. Of course, it's not a large chunk of the game, but it's big enough to be annoying. On the subject of not being totally self-aware, the rune system, while not egregious, is wholly unnecessary and feels more like a distraction than a fun side thing. To give you a quick rundown, runes are one of the few upgrade paths alongside weapon mods and armor upgrades. While the other two upgrades you get points for by either just playing or by picking up an item that's generally not very hidden away, the rune system is all about challenges. Now you would expect that if you had to do a challenge to get an upgrade, said upgrades would be pretty useful, right? Well, not really. The rewards of these rune challenges range from barely noticeable to downright trivial. This is even more of a shame when the trials themselves feel pretty detached from the main game, forcing to use a specific weapon to do a specific thing, stripping the game of its creativity and freedom that makes the game feel the way it does. However, the plus side is if you don't enjoy these challenges, due to the runes being almost completely unnoticeable, you can very easily skip them and not have any problems down the line. The last of the problems that I noticed is the platforming segments. I am very thankful that they exist. Playing non-stop combat would be very exhausting, so these sections serve as a much needed break from the violence. But the issue is that they just aren't the best. They're pretty forgettable at best, and at worst, very frustrating. Something is very wrong with the geometry on some of the platforms that makes it where your jump doesn't register and you fall to your death. To be totally fair, that isn't all the time, so mostly it's just there to be something else to do besides combat, but I do wish it was a little tighter. Taking a step back and looking at the big picture, my gripes are very minor. Every piece of art can subjectively do something better. There's nothing perfect in this world, but Doom 2016 does so many amazing things that it's too difficult to ignore. The gameplay is the most airtight thing I've ever played in my entire life. The music is badass. The sound design is suitably punchy. The story is mostly out of the way and treats Doom Guy as the player, and best of all, it's just a plain good time. How it achieves all that it does is a marvel in and of itself, but the fact that it takes those achievements and points them back to the main design goal makes it the obvious Game of the Decade choice for me. Despite everything that I've said so far, this video is not to show that Doom 2016 is the best game in the last 10 years. Because it's not. It's impossible for me to be able to know what the best game of the decade is, because only you know what it is. Whether it's for really in-depth reasons like I had for this video or not, each and every one of you know what the game of the decade is for your own equally valid reasons, which it may be Doom, but it also might not. I'm TheAmazinggap, and thanks for watching.